I will be speaking today. And a short note, there is 8 stations with 7 trees, and I took the wrong turn at the end, so one tree, wild cherry, will not be seen in this recording. And to briefly position myself, I'm entering the 3rd year of doctoral studies under the mentorship of Dr. Kristina Pranic. I'm employed as an assistant researcher at the University of Nova Gorica, and I'm focusing on the water-centered approach for researching the history of socialist Yugoslav avant-garde, examining experimental and performative works which collaborated with water. From my master's studies on, I share a deep interest for the topic of ecology and arts, especially for the ways to inform art theory with insights from environmental humanities, and so ecologize the frameworks with which we study art. Because of that, I was very excited to respond to this call, and I decided to use this opportunity to stay with the question of how to think about arts ecologically, and what kind of understandings of art are promoted when thinking about it during ecological crisis. I want to begin with a reflection on a kind of a trap I personally enter when I think about climate change and art. In trying to justify the connection between the artwork and ecological thought, I notice I am strongly drawn to sweeping moral narratives, the big claims that connect a particular artistic gesture to vast environmental problems. In trying to see art through an ecological lens, I often end with arguments that feel a bit too blunt, attributing to art a transformative social and ecological power it may not possess, especially within institutional frameworks of the art world, where art is bound to overproduction, to the demand of innovation, and enclosed within its own circle. In order to reflect this trap, I articulate what would be an ecological understanding of art for myself. I will briefly sketch a few very simplified extremes in how art is positioned within environmental concerns. In critical responses to work that engage with ecological questions, I often feel objections that they are preaching to the choir, moralizing, or a critique that they fail to provide any concrete solution. Such comments are rooted in a solution-oriented view of art, one that values and justifies art through practical outcomes. Within this framework, two of the possible understandings of art would be firstly a perspective in which art is valued as a tool to achieve something, to foster change, to move us closer to a more inclusive future, or a representational perspective in which art represents a natural occurrence or functions as a mediation, as one amongst the informers, a medium to make ecological crisis perceptible, to amplify the awareness, or to help us conceptualize certain phenomena. Both of these are, if simplified, posing a question of what can art do in the face of ecological catastrophe, arguing that change is necessary and it can happen in the sphere of art as a public good. At the opposite end of this simplified spectrum would be a completely aestheticist position that insists on the autonomy of art. Here the ecological potentials are not in the power to mobilize, but in its own internal processes as ecological forms that enact ecological relations. I would like to propose that both the solutionist and the aestheticist perspective are produced on the binary opposition of art and its environment, or broadly nature and culture, and are thus limited to the horizon of orienting either towards what is presumably outside of the arts or to the immanent operations of art. This binary model, which is deeply embedded in many intellectual traditions, is critically reflected upon many authors from environmental humanities. One amongst perhaps best known concepts is Donna Haraway's concept of nature culture that she proposed in 2003. So, and to conclude a bit, so the aestheticist approach I suggest tends to simplify the environment by subordinating it to aestheticist concerns, positioning it as a passive backdrop. In such an approach, the site is abstracted and the analysis of the work becomes less responsive to its context. The solutionist approach, on the other hand, also reduces the entanglement between art and environment by approaching environment as graspable and knowable. In contrast to both, the understanding that complicates this and exposes the embeddedness of art is an understanding of art as the one which situates itself and its participants within complex networks of relations, destabilizing fixed positions of knowing and being. Art which does not offer solutions or aesthetize detachment, but instead generates disorientation, revealing the instability of human-centered perspectives and the porous boundaries between the presumably fixed categories. In this, art functions simultaneously as a way of knowing and an embodied experience of more than human entanglements. To continue with this approach, I would like to propose or try out a more situated and a site-centered approach for the works that happen outside classical spaces dedicated to arts, an approach which foregrounds the importance of site as an active element in artistic practice. So for this contribution, I will try to focus on the park as a lens to analyze one of the iterations of Neja Tomšič's ongoing project, Untangling a Garden. The iteration happened on the 11th and 12th of September this year in Rafutski Park, and I had the opportunity through Glade Theatre to accompany the last part of the process as a dramaturg. Neja Tomšič's work is likely very familiar to local audience, so I will skip a thorough introduction to her artistic practice, but I would still like to emphasize some parts about it. So her work is research-based, formed around long-term projects with multiple and diverse public iterations to tackle the investigated phenomena. The research focus of her work is often developed from the examination of a space. She is also a part of a monument group, a project of studying public spaces. Since her first project within the context of performing arts, Opium Clippers, Tomšič has been developing a compelling and complex model of artistic research in the Slovenian performing arts landscape. Her work is distinguished by the careful design of formats of encounter for the audience to engage effectively with the research material. The format I will be referring to today is a storytelling walk, Untangling a Garden Free. The project had multiple iterations up till now, including planting of the Socan Radicchio, sound installation, a performance in progress of mapping its architecture and connecting it with plants brought from Slovenia to Alexandria in Cukrarna, and a geolocated audio walk in Rafutski Park. An event of similar format as Untangling a Garden Free already took place in autumn last year, when Neja invited 7 storytellers with different backgrounds to prepare a story around one tree from Rafutski Park. This time we continued to work with the stories that were composed by Ana Duša, Ana Čavić, Maja Čehovin-Korsika, Katarina Nachtigal, Rok Kušlan, Silvia Viviani, Katja Schulz, and Neja Tomšič. Additionally, this time we also worked with a vocal group, Ardeo, which performed and sang vocal compositions by Gašper Torkar. In Untangling a Garden Free, the stories tackle the multiple layers of history sedimented in Rafutski Park by focusing on 7 out of 1,100 trees. Therefore, the windows of these tangled realities that we experience in the park today are bamboo, cypress, magnolia, wisteria, yew, cork oak, and wild cherry. The event starts by hosts gathering the audience and leading it to the small auditorium in the park where Neja Tomšič awaits, standing on one of the stairs. She contextualizes one of the earliest exotic parks in nowadays Slovenian territory, focusing on the location and its trajectories from the moment when the park was bought by Anton Laščák in the first half of the 20th century. Laščák built a neo-oriental style villa, and while this building remains to be a focal attraction in the park, this performance focuses on the trees and on the fact that the park's unique microclimate nurtures species found nowhere else in Slovenia. At the end of Tomšič's story, the female choir Ardeo starts singing repetitively the Latin name of the first tree station, Bamboo. Hearing them sing turns the attention of the audience towards the bamboo forest in front of the auditorium, where the singers are standing. Throughout the performance, they are short compositions, every time a repetitive singing of a score with the Latin name of the upcoming tree marks the transitions, calling the audience from one tree to the next. In this storytelling walk, Rafutski Park is invited to operate as a multi-layered place from which a multiplicity of associations can be activated. The dramaturgy of each story and of the whole performance is shaped by viewing the park as a host of innumerable realities that inform its present, making complexity the central experience, an encounter with the inexhaustible amount of layers of histories, materials, and meanings, some of which will remain forever inaccessible. By engaging with the park and its complexities through 7 trees and through 7 narratives, each of them a constellation of personal experience, scientific and botanical facts, mythical accounts, and history, we are guided through 7 possible modes of engagements that are inconsistent, partial, and provisional in its attempt to grasp the reality of a tree. Because of that, I propose that the work structurally adopts or mirrors some of the logic of the trees and thus creates an arboreal dramaturgy. I also propose to look at this performance through the lens of arboreal dramaturgy. In thinking about this, I'm inspired by a conversation on plant-based dramaturgy with Manuela Infante in Transmissions in Motion seminar from 2020, in which she was reflecting on her performance Estado Vegetal, where she developed plant-based principles of deep time, ramification, morphing, and branching out. By focusing on the logics of the trees, three characteristics seem especially productive to think about Tomšic's work: branching, entangling, and rooting. Branching draws attention to the performance structure, in our case the stationary rhythm of 8 stops connected by passage of walking and singing interventions. It also draws attention to the narrative logic of each story and to the connections and relations in their content. Entangling raises a question of which relations the work acknowledges and generates and which connections it cultivates. Rooting, on the other hand, asks how and where the work situates itself. Together, the lens of the arboreal dramaturgy illuminates the extent to which the piece is shaped by its site, understanding the park and the trees not just as a backdrop or a scenography, a material, a performer, a medium, or a topic, but as a call for a dramaturgical model that insists on the entanglement of human and non-human agents, of past presences and present intentions. So firstly, how and what does the performance branch? The stories differ in the perspective and draw from biology, mythology, history, geography, personal experience, literature, tradition, and thus function as little branches through which the park's reality can spread. They do not follow a linear logic of telling a story about the tree, but take the tree as a focal point around which different aspects are woven. Traveling to the 7 stations becomes a process of sedimentation, enriching the reality of the park without any intention to fully grasp it or to create a closure. Although the event is structured around storytelling stations and shaped by language, the act of walking between the selected trees introduces an embodied dimension. Movement intensifies the branching of associations. The brief passages, sometimes silent, sometimes filled with conversation, allow for a sensorial encounter, each time enchanted by one more story. They create small windows for wandering. As parks bear witness to countless individual and collective events and print them into the landscape itself, walking and being in a park itself evokes an associative engagement and modes of rest, recreation, sociality, contemplation, and withdrawal. In this sense, branching not only reveals the structural logic of the performance, but also reveals how the park, as an associative field, is continually activated. Besides that, working with the park also forges connections across dispersed realities, linking us to other places and times through the stories themselves. Such a network perspective is already spreading from the park itself, from its heterogeneity, since it gathers species that would rarely be found growing together. The next aspect of arboreal dramaturgy, entangling, exposes the role of the choir that is always introducing the next stop by exposing the botanical dimension of plant classification. The choir is unifying the station into one performative artwork and intensifying the performativity of the event through its recurrent presence. By using storytelling and singing, Untangling a Garden Free foregrounds the significance of voice and language. Both singing and storytelling are practices rooted in intimate, oral and collective exchange, and rely on a shared attention and a co-construction of meaning, thus perhaps offering options for a more collaborative and possibly even an ecological approach. In emphasizing collective meaning-making, it is crucial to also mention the collaborative and in a way curatorial approach in creating this work. Tomšič invited 7 collaborators to create their own stories alongside a choir and a composer. By contributing and planting their stories within the park, each participant multiplies the park's layers. While entangling and branching function as strong procedural principles that generate an effective experience of the park's complexity, the notion of rooting, by positioning the work to the park that is in the focus of the research, emphasizes the situatedness of the work and sheds a different light on its dispersed and open-ended content. The stories, though centered on trees as mediators of meaning, often refer to the reality of Rafutsky Park only in their opening moments. Because of that, the necessity of the site physically, the work's dependence on the physical site appears less pronounced, suggesting that, apart from Tomšic's prologue, it could potentially be transported to another park, which points to the aesthetic abstraction of the trees. At the same time, rooting points to the human-centeredness of the stories, perhaps influenced by the fact that the trees are taken as parts of the park. Namely, parks are specific landscapes. They are human-made spaces that construct and frame what we perceive as nature and show how we imagine it to be. In that sense, the work reflects the idea of the park and the role of the trees in such environments. Taken together, the principles of branching, entangling, and rooting create a framework to meet with the park as a constellation of intertwined temporalities, shaped by and responding to our human presence. Echoing the logic of the trees, the performance resists the construction of a mastering or totalizing narrative of knowing, instead adopting a fragmented and open-ended form that allows the unarticulated and unrecorded to persist in their haunting presence. Through this, the performance situates itself in the sediments of Rafutski Park, offering a dispersed and attentive entry, while simultaneously exposing the limits of representation and the impossibility of full comprehension. Trying out a site-centered approach led the analysis towards recognizing the ways in which the space of the park and the trees shape the performance in its internal logic. In a way, this direction is a direction of trying to situate the analysis itself in the location of the performance, and thus recognizing the agency of the environment which we are part of. Importantly, works that research the space and engage directly with the site expose the vulnerability of the arts. Both in their creative processes and in public sharings, they reveal the site's own power, its resistance to control, unpredictability, and ungraspability. Namely, spaces that are not dedicated specifically to art require different adjustments, different working dynamics, and different strategies, as the focus and the attention is organized differently. Here, the site can eat the performance, overgrow it, or literally wash over it. During ecological crisis, the significance of outdoor site-specific works gains a different meaning and importance. Climate change exposes the location not only as a backdrop or abstracted setting, seen only for their aesthetic fit, but brings with it the whole awareness of the vanishing and endangered ecosystems, and so establishes them as dynamic, as collaborators, and as co-creators. In the light of rapid erasure of public green areas that do not hold profitable futures for the municipality or private investors, parks show up as an indispensable element of an urban life. As absorbents of carbon dioxide, reservoirs of cool air amid increasingly dry and hot summers, buffers for noise pollution, etc. As environmental concerns are ever more pressing, they are reminders of ecological catastrophes, places that show that the return to the paradise, to the Garden of Eden, is impossible because the very idea of paradise is different. The nature as such, as Timothy Morton wrote, does not exist. Thank you very much.